Good morning and welcome to Sunday School. This Sunday, I want to stray a little bit from actually quite a lot from the quarterly lesson, and I want to take us into the book of Job and talk a little bit about Job's story, some theological points we can make from Job's story and what he was encountering. And I want you to turn to Job 19. So we're kind of going to jump into the midst of Job. And many of you are, of course, familiar with the story of Job as told in the book of Job. We don't know who the author of this is for sure. It may have been Job. It may have been Moses. It may have been some writer at the time, some other Israelite, some Hebrew writer, don't know for sure. But it tells kind of two different stories. There are two plots as to what's going on in the book of Job. One in heaven, the wager, if we want to use that term, between Satan and God, and the plot on earth involving Job and his friends and his wife and other people. And both of these plots consist of debates. The heavenly debate is whether there is anybody on earth that loves God for his own sake and not for the blessings he can get out of God. The key to the tension between the heavenly plot and the earthly plot is that Job and his friends don't know about this wager between God and Satan, this wager in heaven, and they never do find out. Briefly, let's go to actually, I should have turned to it in advance. Let's go to the first chapter of Job. I managed to turn into the Psalms, so you want to get a little bit before the Psalms. And let's go to the first chapter of Job, and let me just make a couple comments here. And the first chapter of the book of Job points out that Job was a righteous man. In verse 1, it says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And he had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he had 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 she-asses and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. So he's a very wealthy man, but the point I wanted to make there was that God took note that Job was a perfect and upright man. God sees our lives. He sees what we do. And go to chapter 2 now. In verse 1, it says, again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. Now, I read that, and I've done a lot of background reading on this. That indicates that Satan has not yet been cast out of heaven. Because you have the angels coming, and your Bible may say angels, King James says sons of God, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan was amongst them. So I read that as he not having been cast out of heaven yet. And the Lord said unto Satan, from whence thou comest? And Satan answered the Lord, he said, from going to and fro in the earth and from walking up and down in it. And God says, did you notice Job? My servant Job, that there's none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil, and still he holdeth fast his integrity, although thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause. See, the wager has already taken place between God and Satan, and that's back in verse 1. And you can see, if you go back to verse 1, again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them. So it's the same verbiage that we see in chapter 2. The Lord said unto Satan, where'd you come from? Going to and fro in the earth, walking up and down. And the Lord said unto Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him in the earth, perfect and upright man. And Satan said in verse 9, doth Job fear God for naught? Hast thou not made a hedge about him and about his house? And so he basically says, yeah, because he's wealthy and he's got everything, sure, he'll serve you. But if you take all that away, he won't. He'll curse you to your face. And the Lord said, no, he won't. And so there's this wager that's between the two, this cosmic battle between God and Satan. Will Job serve God just for the sake of serving God? Will he love God just for the sake of loving God, for God's own sake? Or is it tied to Job's possessions? Is it tied to the blessings he can get out of God? And the question for us is, why do we serve God? Would we still serve God if everything crashed down around us, if everything fell apart? And you know the story. He lost his family. He lost his livestock. He lost all of his wealth. He had great physical pain. And so let's go to chapter 19 in the book of Job. And that's where I want to pick up with the reading. Let me read chapter 19 to you. Then Job answered and said, this is after his friends. Now, you remember a little bit more background. I'm sorry about that. A little bit more background. Job had 3 friends, and I would put friends in air quotes because they weren't really too helpful to him, but they came and sat with him. But then when Job spoke, they responded and they gave him advice, so-called advice. And finally, Job answered them. And he said, how long will you vex my soul and break me in pieces with words? These 10 times have you reproached me. They each made their own speeches. Ye are not ashamed that ye make yourself strange to me. And be it indeed that I have erred, mine error remaineth within myself. If indeed ye will magnify yourselves against me and plead against me my reproach, know now that God hath overthrown me and hath compassed me with his net. Behold, I cry out of wrong, but I'm not heard. I cry aloud, but there is no judgment. He hath fenced up my way, I cannot pass, and he hath set darkness in my paths. He has stripped me of my glory and taken the crown from my head. So he's complaining to his friends of their cruel treatment. He hath destroyed me on every side, I am gone, and mine hope hath he removed like a tree. He hath also kindled his wrath against me, and he counteth me unto him as one of his enemies. His troops come together and raise up their way against me, and encamp round about my tabernacle. He hath put my brethren far from me, and mine acquaintances are verily estranged from me. My kinsfolk have failed, and my familiar friends have forgotten me. They that dwell in mine house and my maids count me for a stranger. I am an alien in their sight. My breath is strange to my wife, though I entreated for the children's sake of mine own body. Yea, young children despise me. I arose, and they spake against me. All my inward friends abhorred me, and they whom I loved are turned against me. My bone cleaveth to my skin and to my flesh, and I'm escaped with the skin of my teeth. Have pity upon me, O ye my friends, for the hand of God hath touched me. Why do you persecute me as God, and are not satisfied with my flesh? Oh, that my words were now written. Oh, that they were printed in a book, that they were graven with an iron pen and lead in the rock forever. But listen to this, verse 25. For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not another, though my reins be consumed within me. But ye should say, why persecute we him, seeing the root of the matter is found in me? Be ye afraid of the sword, for wrath bringeth the punishments of the sword, that ye may know there is a judgment. So we got these 2 plots going on, the one in heaven and the one on the earth. And the debate on earth is between Job and his friends. Why is he suffering so much worse than others? Is basically what Job's complaint is. Remember, they're accusing him of sin. And he says, I haven't sinned. But why am I suffering so much more than others? And they're certain that Job must be secretly sinning, but he insists that he's not. He protests his innocence to all of his friends. Now, we know who's right. We know Job is right. He hasn't sinned, inwardly or outwardly, but nobody knew that. Job didn't know that, or the friends didn't know that. Job knew it. Nobody else knew that. Job was convinced of it. They tried to play with his mind. So just why don't you admit that, yeah, you secretly sinned somehow. And even if you didn't, your sons did, or your children did. Let me make a few points here. Point 1, in any particular case of suffering, None of us knows the whole picture. Keep that in mind. None of us knows the whole picture. God does. None of us does. Job's friends thought they knew the whole picture. They did not. They did not know. Job himself didn't even know. Why am I going through this? Nobody knew what was going on in heaven between Satan and God. Second point, the real question is not undeserved suffering. The real question is a question of faith. Can you go on believing in a good God when everything is going wrong? It boils down to whether you trust God, whether you really believe in him when things are terrible. Third point, what was Job's greatest pain? It wasn't physical. It wasn't social isolation pain. It wasn't mental pain. It was spiritual. Because through all that he was going through, if you read the book of Job, he cries out to God to answer him 36 times before God finally answers. His biggest pain was through all of what he was going through, he lost touch with God. He couldn't get through to God. It's that pain that is the biggest challenge to faith. Can we stay faithful when God doesn't seem to answer us? So if we think of the characters in the story of the book of Job, we have God, Satan, or the Satan, as the Bible refers to him, Job, Job's wife, his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. So the first things the friends do, and I would encourage you to sit down and read the book of Job. So preceding chapter 19, the first things the friends do is a good thing. They come and sit with it. They didn't open their mouths. And that's a good thing to do. Sometimes that's the best thing we can do for someone who's suffering. Just sit with them, be with them. Unfortunately, Job opened his mouth and he cursed the day that he was born. He said, my mother should have aborted me. He cursed the day that he was born. He cursed. He stopped short of cursing God, but he cursed about everything else about himself. And that starts the three friends into a debate. And each of them speaks three times. Eliphaz spoke first. He was the oldest. He was also the gentlest and the most sensitive. And he denies the problem. And he says, I'm convinced by history, Job, and a vision that I had, that you're being punished because you have sinned. And he says, look, Job, we're all sinners. So why don't you admit it? And Job responds that he's not. But then he says, why am I suffering more than others? Even assuming you're true, what you say is true, Eliphaz, why am I suffering more than others? And Eliphaz responds, well, Job, suffering brings good discipline. It's God's way of making you a better person. Now that's really comforting, reassuring to Job. Just accept the discipline and be humble about it. But then he accuses Job of irreverence, the lack of a response. Eliphaz is forcing experience into doctrine, and we can't do that. He then says, well, Job, you're just little Job here, and God's big God, big creator of the universe. He's too big to be involved in your situation. And so ultimately, Eliphaz takes refuge in God's transcendence. And he's done speaking. And they speak in cycles. They don't all speak at once. They're three speeches and then come back to another one. One speaks and then another and then another. Then we go back to the first one. But that's kind of encapsulates everything that Eliphaz said. Bildad's the next one. He's a little bit younger, probably about 20 years younger. Bildad means God's darling. I don't know who gave him that name. It certainly didn't fit what Bildad said. But he's probably about 20 years younger than Eliphaz. He's a theologian. He's a traditionalist. He's full of jargon and full of formulas. He's indignant and angry. There's no trace of compassion with Bildad as you go back and read what he said to Job. He said, Job, if you hadn't sinned, then your children must have. If you haven't sinned, your children must have. It's the law of cause and effect, you see. If you sin, you suffer. So Bildad takes refuge in God's omnipotence. God is bigger than we are, so we can't argue with him. Just accept it, Job. But if that's the case, then that makes us mere puppets on a string. Zophar is the third one to speak, and he's the youngest. He's the most dogmatic of the three. He's Job Blunt. He accuses Job of filibustering, just taking time, just talking to cover up. And he wants Job to stop talking. He insists that Job is sinning unconsciously without realizing it. And this is very insulting to Job. And so Zophar takes refuge in God's omniscience. God knows the sins that Job is committing. So Job makes his speeches. He makes 10 speeches, 3 of each to his friends, and then 1 to Elihu, the teenager, afterwards, whom his speech really is silence. And what does he say? He says, God is responsible for my suffering. And that's what we see in Job 19. God's responsible. I cannot repent because I'm not conscious of any sin. And he utterly refuses to say what is not true. He said they were trying to force him to say that he's a sinner, and he was not. He's a righteous man. Well, a couple of points there. You can live a righteous life. You can live a life without sinning. And there's no such thing as unconscious sin. Remember John Wesley's definition of sin. It's a willful transgression against a known law of God. There's no such thing as unconscious sin. And you can live a righteous life. But there's a progression in Job's speeches. He gets bolder with each one and in his speeches to God, but there's an alteration in his moods, despair and hopelessness, and then confidence and hope. He kind of cycles through his emotions, as we all do as we go through rough times. He has a very frank and honest talk with God, a one-sided one. God's not answering him. And he wants to take God to court. He's very bold. He's challenging God. And in his good moods, he comes to the point where he believes that it will all be settled even after he dies. But in his bad moods, he says, if a man dies, will he live again? So he has alternating moods. It's very human and very real. And when you see this as you read through the book of Job, you particularly get into chapter 28. Charles Wesley wrote a hymn based on chapter 28. But chapter 31, as you move forward, is a protest about his innocence. It makes you think that Job heard the Sermon on the Mount. When you read chapter 31, read that with the Sermon on the Mount and compare the two. And it makes you think that he actually heard the Sermon on the Mount. Now, he hadn't, but it's very interesting to read that. So after the friends make their speeches and they hear Job's response, they walk off. And there's a teenager standing there, Elihu, and of course he knows everything. He's very bold. He says he has something new to say, but he really has nothing new to say. He tells Job that God is helping to mend his ways. And I forgot to silence my phone. Sorry about that. And he says, you need to mend your ways. God's helping you mend your ways. And Job doesn't respond to that. And Elihu leaves. The friends were wrong in applying the notion that as a man sows, so shall he reap. They were applying that to all situations. We can't do that. It doesn't always apply to all situations. And so Job, we see toward the end of the book of Job, he begins to argue with God. And he wished he hadn't. He wanted God to respond. God finally responds. And boy, he wishes that God hadn't responded, because God reminds Job who he's talking to. As I said, Job had asked God 36 times to talk, and now I wish he hadn't asked. And God reminds Job, you're not God. He says, would you discredit my justice? And then God talks about his creatures toward the end of the book of Job. And it's funny, he asks him, why do you think I created the hippopotamus and the crocodile? What he's saying to Job is, you don't understand me. You don't understand God. God tells Job that he doesn't understand the animal world. He doesn't understand the moral world. But the point here is that Job is back in touch with God again. Now he wishes that he hadn't argued at all. He repents of his lack of faith, and God restores him. He gets everything back, and some of it much more than he had to begin with. Note that God never answered Job's questions, never told him about what had happened in heaven. The test was whether Job would trust God without knowing. Let that thought sink in. And my final point here is human pride expresses itself in a demand to know the reason, to know everything. We call God to our judgment, but God's not answerable to us. What God wanted was a Job who would say, God, I trust you. The relationship is not affected by what's happened. I don't need to know why this is happening to me as long as we're talking again. So there's a sense in which the cross of Christ puts a different value on human suffering. Job is a type of Christ, an innocent sufferer. Through the cross, and we read the book of Job on the backside of the cross. Try to put yourself, when you read Job, in Job's position. He has no knowledge of the cross of Christ. He has no knowledge of what's going on in heaven about this wager. Through the cross, we see that God can use suffering for good. Under the pressure of the crucifixion and pain, even Jesus lost touch with the reason for why he was doing what he was doing and why it all happened. He cried out, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" You see, sometimes we feel like that. But the proof is in the pudding. Can we trust God without knowing the reason why we go through what we go through? That's the test of faith. And Job never followed his wife's advice to curse God and die. He said, God had done this to me. I don't understand why. I want to talk to him. I want to get him in court. I want to beat him in court. I haven't done anything wrong. Can we live our life with Christian perfection so that our consciences are clear and we can say, as Job said, I have not sinned, neither consciously nor unconsciously. God, I'm right with you. You can do whatever you want to do with me. I'll still serve you. That's the lesson of the book of Job, and that's what God would have us hear today. May blessings be upon you. May blessings be upon Brother Merle as he brings the morning message to you, and we'll see you next Sunday.